The expression of complete disbelief on Edward's face when I revealed the acquisition documents showing my name as the new owner of Blackwell Industries, just moments after he'd announced he was leaving me for his 29-year-old executive assistant, is something I'll remember with satisfaction for the rest of my days. My name is Catherine Blackwell, and throughout our 4 decades of marriage, I had methodically become the anonymous buyer of the very manufacturing empire my husband believed was his alone to command. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Welcome to my channel. Before we continue, tell me where you're watching from in the comments. And if you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have known better, make sure to hit that subscribe button. I have something truly special coming tomorrow that you won't want to miss. This faded photograph shows Edward and me on our wedding day 43 years ago. I was 22, fresh out of Northwestern with my business degree, standing beside the ambitious 26-year-old man who'd promised we would build something extraordinary together, though Edward would later tell acquaintances we'd met at a charity gala, where I was helping with the decorations. The truth was we'd connected during our business administration program, where I'd graduated with highest honors. The hopeful smile on my young face reflected our shared vision for the future, though I couldn't have imagined how differently we would each interpret together as the decades passed. I grew up in a small manufacturing town in Pennsylvania, where my grandmother had taken over Hartwell Tool and Die after my grandfather's unexpected death in 1960. "Never surrender your independence, Kathy," she would say while showing me the accounting books after school. "Men notice the showroom floor, but your security depends on what you build in the machine shop where they rarely venture." That wisdom would prove prophetic 40 years later, in ways neither of us could have anticipated. I married Edward when his ambition was still housed in a rented warehouse where he assembled industrial valves. What he brought was charisma and sales ability. What I contributed was operational strategy and financial discipline I'd learned at my grandmother's side. Though Edward preferred introducing me at industry functions as the supportive wife with the good head for household budgeting, the reality was far different. When we secured our first major business loan, the banker directed all financial questions to Edward, despite my business degree and the comprehensive projections I had prepared. After that humiliating experience, we developed an unspoken arrangement. Edward would be the public face of Blackwell Industries, while I structured the foundation from behind the scenes. By our 15th anniversary, I had made a pivotal decision. Rather than investing my unpaid labor and financial expertise solely into Edward's increasingly independent vision, I would begin building my own position within the industrial landscape, not through title or recognition, but through carefully calculated investment. My first strategic acquisition occurred when Edward restructured the company in our 18th year of marriage. While he focused on the prestige of our new corporate headquarters in Pittsburgh, I quietly arranged to acquire supplier shares through a separate investment entity called Hartwell Capital Partners, named for my grandmother's maiden name. Edward, now accustomed to handling what he called the big picture decisions, delegated the paperwork to me with minimal attention. "Just make sure my ownership position remains controlling," he instructed, before leaving for a golf tournament in Palm Beach. What he failed to notice in the documents he hastily signed was that while he maintained majority control of Blackwell Industries itself, my separate investment entity had secured significant positions in the critical supply chain companies that would become increasingly essential to our operations. For the next 2 decades, as Blackwell Industries expanded from industrial valves to comprehensive fluid management systems for manufacturing plants across the Midwest, I methodically strengthened Hartwell Capital's position through strategic acquisitions. Each time the company needed additional materials or components, I ensured my separate entity participated in the supply network, always legally sound but never identified as connected to me personally. Edward's knowledge of my involvement remained superficial. He vaguely understood that I dabbled in some industry investments, as he characterized it to our accountant. But the extent of my strategic positioning remained obscured by legitimate business structures and his own disinterest in what he dismissed as background operations. "Catherine has her little investment hobby," he once told our financial advisor within my hearing. "It keeps her occupied while I handle the actual business." The advisor, who understood exactly how substantial my hobby had become, maintained professional neutrality while meeting my eyes briefly over Edward's shoulder. By our 35th anniversary, Hartwell Capital Partners had acquired controlling interests in 76% of Blackwell Industries' critical suppliers, while also establishing positions in competing firms that made Edward's company increasingly vulnerable to supply chain pressures he didn't fully comprehend. The warning signs of Edward's wandering attention began during our 38th year of marriage. Business trips grew longer. Weekend emergency meetings became routine, and his enthusiastic descriptions of his new executive assistant's organizational capabilities seemed excessive for someone with basic administrative responsibilities. Victoria. Palmer had joined the company at 27 with modest qualifications, but remarkable ability to make Edward feel even more impressive than he already considered himself. By our 40th anniversary, a milestone Edward suggested we celebrate when things settle down, due to an urgent strategic retreat that coincidentally included Victoria, I had positioned Hartwell Capital Partners to make its most significant move. If you've ever had someone underestimate your capabilities simply because they weren't paying attention, hit that subscribe button and notification bell, because in part 2, you'll discover exactly what happened when Edward announced he was leaving our marriage, and how completely unprepared he was for what I had methodically built over 40 years of being underestimated. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Edward's expression froze when I placed the acquisition documents on the mahogany coffee table in our living room. He stared at the papers, then at me, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and finally anger as the implications sank in. "This has to be some kind of trick, Catherine," he finally managed, pushing the papers away as if distance might change their contents. "You can't possibly own Blackwell Industries. I built this company from nothing." "We built it," I corrected gently. "The difference is that I kept records of my contributions while you were busy taking credit." "How long have you been planning this?" Edward demanded, his voice shifting to the authoritative tone he typically used when feeling threatened in business situations. "This feels calculated." "About as calculated as your relationship with Victoria," I replied, maintaining the calm demeanor that had served me well through decades of being underestimated. "The difference is that my actions were defensive, not deceptive. Everything documented in these papers was properly executed, fully legal, and signed by you." Edward reached for the acquisition documents again, examining them more carefully this time. I could see his mind working, the businessman I'd watched operate for decades, as he searched for loopholes or technicalities that might invalidate what he was seeing. "The board won't stand for this," he finally said, though with noticeably less conviction than before. I selected each member personally. "The board is loyal to shareholder value," I corrected. "Something I've been quietly protecting while you've been increasingly distracted by personal interests. I've had private conversations with several key members over the past few months, expressing concerns about leadership stability." This was another revelation Edward hadn't anticipated. While he'd been planning his exit from our marriage, I had been methodically securing my position with the board members he assumed were exclusively his allies. "You went behind my back to the board?" The betrayal in his voice was ironic, given the circumstances that had brought us to this confrontation. "I spoke with them as the company's new controlling investor with legitimate concerns about leadership succession," I clarified. "Which, given your current announcement about leaving your wife for an employee 37 years your junior, now appears remarkably prescient." Edward stood abruptly and paced across the living room, stopping at the large window that overlooked the garden. I had meticulously maintained while he built what he considered his independent success. The late afternoon light cast long shadows across the lawn as the implications of his new reality settled over him. "What exactly do you want, Catherine?" he finally asked, still facing the window. "Is this about money? A bigger settlement?" The question revealed how fundamentally he still misunderstood the situation. Even now, he believed this was a negotiating tactic rather than the culmination of decades of strategic positioning. "This isn't about extracting concessions, Edward. This is about acknowledging the actual power dynamics in our relationship, both personal and professional." I gathered the documents back into their folder with deliberate precision. "I don't need to negotiate for what I already legally control." He turned back toward me, his expression hardening into something more familiar, the calculated assessment he applied to business challenges. "You realize this will damage the company. A public fight for control during divorce proceedings will tank the stock value and frighten clients." "Which is precisely why there won't be a public fight," I replied. "The transition documentation is already prepared. You'll announce your early retirement due to personal reasons, and I'll step in as interim chairperson while the board conducts a formal search for new executive leadership." "You've thought of everything," he said, a grudging acknowledgement in his voice. "I've had 40 years of watching you take credit for my thinking, Edward. It tends to sharpen one's strategic planning skills." The silence that followed was heavy with 4 decades of unspoken truths. Edward had built his identity around being the visionary business leader, the self-made success story. Discovering that his dismissed wife had quietly become his company's new owner challenged not just his immediate plans, but his entire self-concept. "And Victoria?" he finally asked, the question revealing his priorities, even in this moment of personal and professional crisis. "Ms. Palmer will be transferred to our Cleveland office effective immediately. Her continuing employment will depend entirely on her professional conduct and performance, not her personal relationships." Edward's face tightened. "You can't dictate who I'm not dictating your personal choices," I interrupted. "I'm establishing appropriate corporate boundaries as the controlling investor. What you do in your private life after our divorce is your business. Who holds management positions in the company is mine." The ringing doorbell interrupted our standoff. Edward glanced toward the entryway with visible confusion. We rarely received unannounced visitors, particularly on weekday evenings. "That would be Eleanor Matthews," I explained, rising to answer the door. "My attorney. I thought it would be efficient to begin the separation agreement documentation immediately. You invited your lawyer here now?" Edward's stunned expression suggested he was still struggling to grasp how thoroughly I had prepared for this moment. "Actually, she's both my personal attorney and outside counsel for Hartwell Capital. Given the complexity of our situation, her presence will ensure all actions are properly documented from the outset." The distinguished silver-haired woman who entered our living room moments later carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to navigating high-stakes business transitions. After brief introductions, Eleanor placed her briefcase on the coffee table and efficiently laid out a preliminary separation agreement that reflected the new power reality Edward was still struggling to absorb. "As you'll see, Mr. Blackwell, these terms are quite reasonable given the circumstances," Eleanor explained in her characteristic no-nonsense manner. "Mrs. Blackwell will assume chairperson responsibilities at Blackwell Industries while maintaining controlling investor position through Hartwell Capital. You'll transition to emeritus status with appropriate benefits and board observer privileges, though without voting authority." Edward stared at the documents without touching them. "And if I contest this arrangement?" Eleanor's expression remained professionally neutral. "Contesting would trigger the moral conduct clauses in your employment contract, potentially resulting in termination without benefits. Additionally, given the circumstances of your relationship with a subordinate employee, litigation would likely..." involved discovery processes that could prove uncomfortable for all parties. The clinical precision with which she outlined the consequences of resistance seemed to finally penetrate Edward's shock. He had spent decades navigating business negotiations from positions of leverage, but now found himself without viable counter moves. "I need time to review this with my own counsel," he finally said, the businessman in him asserting one last attempt at procedural delay. "Of course," I agreed. "You have until tomorrow afternoon. The board has been called for an emergency session at 4 p.m. to address leadership transition concerns." His head snapped up. "The board meeting is already scheduled before I've even agreed to anything?" "The meeting was called to address legitimate governance concerns raised by significant investors," Eleanor clarified. "Your personal decisions have created potential liabilities that the board must address regardless of your preferences about timing." As Eleanor gathered her materials to leave, promising to return the following day for the signed documents, the full implications of his situation seemed to finally register with Edward. His carefully planned exit, leaving his aging wife while maintaining control of the company and starting a new life with his young assistant, had collapsed entirely, replaced by a humiliating reality in which he had lost control of both the narrative and the company he believed was unquestionably his. After Eleanor departed, Edward retreated to his home office without further discussion. Through the closed door, I could hear him making phone calls, likely to his personal attorney and possibly to Victoria, though I chose not to speculate on those conversations. What mattered was that the careful groundwork I had laid over decades had created a position of strength precisely when I most needed it. If you've ever watched someone underestimate you and wondered when they'd finally realize their mistake, click the subscribe button and notification bell. Because in part 3, you'll see what happened when Edward tried one last desperate move to regain control, and how the board responded to this dramatic shift in power dynamics. The following morning brought the first test of our new reality. I had risen early, as was my habit, and was reviewing final documentation for the board meeting when Edward appeared in the kitchen doorway, dressed in his usual impeccable business attire, but with visible signs of a sleepless night. "I spoke with Victoria last night," he announced without preamble, pouring himself coffee from the pot I had prepared. "She's refusing the Cleveland transfer." "That's certainly her prerogative," I replied calmly. "Her letter of resignation will be accepted immediately with standard non-compete and confidentiality provisions enforced." Edward's expression tightened. "She's planning to accompany me to the board meeting this afternoon to address these changes directly." This was an unexpected development, though not entirely surprising given Victoria's ambition and Edward's likely misrepresentation of his continuing authority. I considered my response carefully before replying. "Victoria is currently a mid-level executive without board access privileges. Her presence would be inappropriate for a governance discussion." I met Edward's gaze directly. "However, if you're determined to create a public confrontation, I should note that I've prepared a comprehensive file documenting questionable expense allocations and potential conflicts of interest regarding her rapid promotion path and compensation adjustments." The implied threat was clear without being explicit. Pushing this into open conflict would result in revelations that would damage both Edward's reputation and Victoria's career prospects well beyond Blackwell Industries. "This isn't over, Catherine," Edward said quietly, though the resignation in his voice suggested he recognized the futility of immediate resistance. "On the contrary," I replied, gathering my materials into the leather portfolio my grandmother had given me on my 60th birthday. "After 40 years of working in your shadow while building my own position, things are just beginning." Edward left for the office without further discussion, presumably to prepare Victoria for the reality neither of them had anticipated when plotting their future together. I spent the morning coordinating with Eleanor and finalizing my presentation for the board. A strange sense of calm had replaced the uncertainty that had shadowed so much of my married life. By early afternoon, Eleanor confirmed that Edward had signed the separation agreement with minimal modification, a pragmatic acceptance of his limited options given the comprehensive legal foundation we had established. The board meeting would proceed as planned, with Edward announcing his retirement for personal reasons while I would be introduced as interim chairperson, pending formal leadership succession planning. The Blackwell Industries headquarters looked impossibly different as I approached it that afternoon. Not because the gleaming glass and steel structure had changed, but because my relationship to it had transformed completely. For decades, I had entered this building as Edward's wife, a peripheral figure occasionally attending company functions. Today, I arrived as the controlling investor prepared to assume formal leadership. The executive elevator, the one Edward had always used while I typically took the general access lifts when visiting, whisked me directly to the 38th floor where the boardroom occupied the prime corner position overlooking the city skyline. Eleanor walked beside me, her confident presence a reminder that this transition was not merely personal vindication, but a carefully orchestrated business restructuring. The board members have all received the briefing documents, I confirmed as we approached the imposing mahogany doors. Delivered securely this morning. Eleanor nodded. 7 of the 9 have already acknowledged receipt and review. Based on preliminary responses, you have clear majority support for the transition plan. This confirmation settled the last whisper of uncertainty. While I had methodically built my investment position and cultivated relationships with key board members, today would be the first explicit test of their willingness to accept my leadership after decades of Edward's unquestioned authority. The boardroom fell silent as we entered. 8 people sat around the massive table with Edward conspicuously positioned at the head position he had occupied for 25 years. His expression remained carefully neutral, though the slight tightness around his eyes betrayed the strain of maintaining this facade. What surprised me was Victoria's presence. Seated not at the administrative position near the door, as would be appropriate for her role, but directly beside Edward in the space typically reserved for the CFO. Her youth appeared even more pronounced in this setting, surrounded by executives with decades of experience. Yet her posture projected practiced confidence. Catherine, Edward acknowledged with forced cordiality. And Ms. Matthews. We were just reviewing the quarterly projections while waiting. The deliberate attempt to frame this as a routine meeting rather than the leadership transition we all knew was coming represented Edward's last attempt to control the narrative. I smiled pleasantly while taking the open seat directly opposite him at the table's far end, not the peripheral position he likely expected me to choose. Thank you all for accommodating this special session, I began, opening my portfolio deliberately. As the briefing materials outlined, we're addressing significant governance transitions necessitated by recent developments. Before I could continue, Victoria leaned forward with a smile that appeared professionally warm, but couldn't quite conceal her underlying tension. Before we begin, I wanted to introduce myself properly to those board members I haven't yet met personally. I'm Victoria Palmer, Senior Executive Advisor to Mr. Blackwell and newly appointed Director of Strategic Initiatives. The tactical move was immediately clear. Edward had apparently created a new executive title for Victoria overnight, attempting to solidify her position before the transition. Several board members shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the transparent maneuver for what it was. That's an interesting development, I replied calmly, especially since executive appointments require board governance committee approval, which doesn't appear on any recent meeting minutes. Richard Bennett, the longest-serving board member, and former university colleague of Edward's, cleared his throat awkwardly. Edward mentioned a temporary special assignment this morning pending formal approval processes. I see. I met Edward's gaze directly across the table. Well, we can address reporting structures after resolving the primary agenda items. Eleanor, would you distribute the signed transition agreements? As Eleanor efficiently handed documents to each board member, Edward's attempt to seize control of the narrative collapsed. The materials clearly outlined his signed agreement to transition to emeritus status, while I assumed interim chairperson responsibilities effective immediately. As you can see, I continued once everyone had received their copies, Edward has recognized that personal circumstances necessitate leadership restructuring to ensure company stability. We've developed a comprehensive transition plan that maintains operational continuity while initiating a formal succession planning process. Victoria's composed expression faltered as she scanned the documents, clearly seeing for the first time the details of Edward's diminished position. She turned to him with questioning eyes, but Edward kept his attention fixed firmly on the papers before him. Melissa Chen, the newest board member and CEO of a major technology firm, spoke first. These terms appear remarkably generous given the circumstances. Edward's emeritus status with full benefits and continuing board observer privileges represents significant accommodation. Her framing, that the arrangement favored Edward rather than penalized him, skillfully established the tone for the discussion. As a widely respected executive who had joined our board just 10 months earlier, Melissa's perspective carried particular weight with the other members. Edward recognized the shifting dynamic but attempted one final assertion of the authority he had wielded for decades. While I appreciate the consideration, I believe a more gradual transition would better serve company interests. Perhaps a 6-month co-leadership arrangement would. The signed agreements don't provide for that option, Eleanor interjected, smoothly. And given the potential conflicts of interest created by recent personal developments, governance best practices strongly recommend immediate and clear leadership delineation. The professional phrasing thinly veiled the underlying reality. Edward's affair with his much younger employee had created an untenable corporate liability that required decisive resolution. The board members exchanged glances, corporate survival, instincts clearly overriding personal loyalties. Richard Bennett sighed heavily before addressing Edward directly. We've worked together for a long time, Edward, and I've always respected your business acumen. But this situation, he gestured vaguely toward Victoria, creates complications we can't ignore. The transition plan protects both your legacy and the company's stability. I recommend we implement it as presented. Victoria, suddenly recognizing how completely her position had collapsed, attempted to salvage something from the rapidly deteriorating situation. As someone who's worked closely with Edward on strategic initiatives, she began, her voice professionally modulated despite visible tension, I should note that several key client relationships are deeply personal connections that might be jeopardized by abrupt leadership changes. It was a calculated attempt to leverage fear of client defections, a legitimate business concern that might override governance considerations. I had anticipated this angle, however, and was prepared with a response that would definitively end her influence in this discussion. That's precisely why we've prepared personalized communications for our top 20 clients to be delivered immediately following this meeting, I replied, removing another document from my portfolio. Additionally, I've arranged individual calls with the 7 strategic clients whose relationships you're likely referencing, Ms. Palmer, including Westbrook Manufacturing and Alpine Systems. Victoria's expression froze momentarily before she recovered her professional composure. The message was clear. I knew exactly which client relationships she had been involved with, undermining her implied threat of unique access or influence. The board vote that followed was merely a formality. The transition plan was approved unanimously, with Edward abstaining rather than opposing, a final concession to preserving at least the appearance of dignity. If you've been undervalued or overlooked in your career, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. In Part 4, you'll see how I transformed the company culture after taking control, the unexpected ally I found on the executive team, and Victoria's surprising next move that no one anticipated. As the board meeting concluded, board members approached, me individually with congratulations that carried varying degrees of surprise at my previously unrecognized capabilities. I've always wondered about the detailed financing strategies behind our supply chain integration, Melissa Chen commented quietly, as others filtered from the room. The elegant approach seemed inconsistent with Edward's typically more aggressive style. I suspect I've been admiring your work without realizing it. Her perceptiveness was unsurprising given her own remarkable career trajectory. Edward has many strengths, I acknowledged diplomatically. But yes, the vertical integration financing and multi-tiered supplier relationship models were primarily my contributions. I'd appreciate the opportunity to discuss those strategies in detail sometime, she replied with genuine professional interest. Perhaps after the transition dust settles. This unexpected moment of authentic recognition from a respected peer, something I had rarely experienced during decades of behind-the-scenes contribution, felt more validating than the formal power transfer itself. Melissa departed with a promise to call later in the week, leaving just Edward, Victoria, Eleanor, and myself in the massive boardroom. The uncomfortable silence was finally broken by Eleanor's practical efficiency. I have the formal announcements prepared for distribution, she noted, checking her watch. The external press release is scheduled for 5:30 with internal communication preceding it by 30 minutes. Is there anything either of you wish to modify in the language previously reviewed? She directed this question to Edward and me, pointedly, excluding Victoria from the decision process. Edward shook his head slightly, his earlier combativeness replaced by resigned acceptance of his new reality. Victoria, however, was not prepared to exit quietly. This won't work, she stated flatly, addressing me directly for the first time. You may control the shares, Mrs. Blackwell, but you don't understand the operational complexities of this business. The executive team has been built around Edward's leadership approach. They won't simply transfer loyalty to someone they view as an outsider who acquired power through marital technicality. The assessment wasn't entirely incorrect. Transitioning an organization built on Edward's personality to new leadership would present challenges beyond merely having legal authority. What Victoria failed to understand was how thoroughly I had prepared for precisely this aspect of the situation. An insightful concern, I acknowledged with professional courtesy, which is why I've spent the past 6 months having private discussions with each key executive about their departmental strategies, resource allocations, and professional development. Priorities. Conversations they found surprisingly valuable given my comprehensive understanding of our operational nuances. Edward's head snapped up at this revelation. You've been meeting with my executive team without my knowledge? Not as your wife, I clarified. As a major investor concerned with succession planning and organizational development, conversations that have laid important groundwork for this transition. The final pieces of understanding seemed to click into place for Edward. Not just that I had acquired controlling ownership, but that I had methodically prepared the entire organization for a leadership transition, while he remained completely unaware. The comprehensive nature of my strategy, developed and executed over months, while he pursued his relationship with Victoria, appeared to finally penetrate his resistance. You've won, Margaret, he said quietly. Completely and thoroughly. What happens now? Now we execute the transition plan with minimal disruption to the business, I replied matter-of-factly. You'll announce your retirement. I'll assume interim leadership, and the board will initiate a formal search for permanent executive succession. A process that will include qualified internal candidates alongside external prospects. I turned to Victoria. Your performance evaluations suggest reasonable capability in your actual role separate from personal entanglements. If you wish to continue in your original position, not the unilaterally created strategic initiatives title, that option remains available, though the Cleveland transfer offer stands if you prefer geographical separation from this situation. The offer wasn't based on generosity, but practical business consideration. Forcing her immediate departure would create unnecessary organizational disruption and potential legal complications that served no strategic purpose. Offering continued employment under appropriate boundaries demonstrated both reasonable leadership and clear establishment of new power realities. Victoria departed without accepting or rejecting the offer, leaving Edward and me alone in the boardroom, where he had reigned as unquestioned authority for decades. Through the wall of windows, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the city skyline, a visual metaphor for the ending of his corporate dominance that seemed almost too perfect. 40 years, he said finally, his voice lacking its usual, authoritative resonance. 40 years we've been married, and I never truly knew what you were capable of. That's not entirely accurate, Edward, I corrected gently. You knew exactly what I was capable of. You simply chose to believe it belonged to you by default, rather than recognizing it as independently valuable. A costly assumption, as it turns. Out. The morning after the board meeting, I arrived at Blackwell Industries headquarters at precisely 7:15 a.m., 15 minutes before the executive team's regular briefing traditionally held in what had been Edward's office. For 40 years, I had organized my schedule around my husband's corporate routine. Now, that office and the authority it represented were mine. As I stepped off the executive elevator, Edward's longtime assistant, Judith, rose from her desk with an expression that revealed both professional composure and personal uncertainty. At 63, Judith had been with the company almost as long as I'd been married to Edward, occupying the powerful gatekeeper position that controlled access to the CEO. "Good morning, Mrs. Blackwell," she greeted me with formal courtesy. "The executive team has been notified of the meeting location change. They'll be gathering in the main conference room rather than—" She hesitated momentarily. "Rather than your office as requested." My first executive decision had been deliberate. Moving the initial leadership meeting from Edward's personal domain to neutral territory. The psychological message was clear. This wouldn't simply be Edward's company with a different person sitting in his chair. This was a substantive transition to new leadership with its own distinct approach. "Thank you, Judith," I replied warmly. "And please, after all these years, I think Catherine would be more appropriate now." Her professional reserve softened slightly. "Of course, Catherine. The briefing materials are prepared, and I've taken the liberty of adding the quarterly divisional assessments you requested yesterday." This small interaction illustrated the first subtle but significant shifts already occurring throughout the organization. Judith, whose loyalty to Edward had been absolute for decades, was methodically transferring that institutional efficiency to the new leadership reality. Her capabilities hadn't changed, merely the direction in which they were applied. The executive team filtered into the conference room over the next 15 minutes. 7 division heads, whose careers had developed entirely under Edward's leadership. Their expressions ranged from carefully neutral to openly curious as they took seats around the table. Most had interacted with me occasionally at company functions, but always as Edward's wife, never as a business authority. "Good morning," I began precisely at 7:30, opening the leather portfolio that had belonged to my grandmother. "Thank you for adjusting to the schedule changes on short notice. I recognize this transition raises natural questions about operational continuity and strategic direction. The conventional beginnings seem to slightly relax their visible tension. Melissa Chen had advised me during our evening call to acknowledge the uncertainty directly rather than pretending it didn't exist. Wisdom that reflected her own experience with corporate transitions. Before we address regular business matters, I want to establish 3 key principles for this interim leadership period, I continued. First, operational decisions will remain with divisional leadership unless broader integration is required. Second, the executive team structure remains, unchanged while performance assessments proceed. And third, all strategic initiatives currently underway continue without disruption pending formal review. The message was clear. This would be evolution, not revolution. Several executives visibly relaxed at this assurance that their immediate authority remained intact. James Donovan, the veteran CFO who had worked alongside Edward for 18 years, spoke first. Catherine, if I may call you that in this context, will you be maintaining the same reporting cadence and structure Edward established? The question was practical, but also a subtle test of my familiarity with executive operations. The weekly, divisional updates and monthly consolidated reviews will continue, I confirmed. However, I prefer comprehensive performance metrics rather than the selective highlights format. Judith has the revised templates for distribution today. This specific knowledge of their reporting deficiencies, something Edward had allowed to develop as executives learned to emphasize favorable data, sent a clear message. I wasn't entering this role with superficial understanding, but with detailed knowledge of their actual operations, including the informational gaps Edward had permitted. If you've ever been dismissed as just a spouse, while knowing you had valuable expertise to offer, hit subscribe and the notification bell. In Part 5, you'll see how one executive emerged as an unexpected ally, the crisis that tested my leadership just weeks into taking control, and Edward's surprising response when Victoria made her next calculated move. The 2-hour meeting proceeded with methodical efficiency. Each executive presented their critical updates. I asked targeted questions that demonstrated understanding of their divisional challenges, and we established clear next steps. By the session's conclusion, the initial wariness had evolved into cautious professional engagement. Not yet full acceptance, but a workable foundation. As the executives departed, Sarah Kendall, our head of international operations and the youngest member of the leadership team, lingered behind. Once the room had cleared, she approached with measured respect. "I wanted to say something that might be inappropriate in the larger setting," she began carefully. "The Asia-Pacific expansion strategy, the one Edward has been resisting for the past year. That original framework was your work, wasn't it?" The question surprised me. That particular strategy, a measured market entry I had developed based on cultural considerations rather than immediate profit potential, had been dismissed by Edward as overly cautious, despite its long-term advantages. "What makes you think that?" I asked, genuinely curious about her perception. The approach was different, more nuanced in its understanding of relationship development across different regional business cultures, she explained. Edward's strategies typically emphasized rapid market penetration and immediate visibility. This plan valued subtlety and incremental trust building. It felt like different thinking. Her perception was remarkably astute. "Yes, the original framework was my work," I acknowledged, though it was presented through appropriate channels rather than direct attribution. "I suspected as much," she nodded. "Some of us have occasionally wondered about the inconsistencies in our strategic approaches, moments of sophisticated cultural insight alongside more aggressive positioning. It makes more sense now." This unexpected recognition from a younger executive suggested that my behind-the-scenes influence had been more visible to perceptive observers than Edward had ever realized. As Sarah departed with a respectful nod, I felt a moment of validation that transcended the formal authority transition. My distinct business thinking had been recognizable, even when deliberately obscured. My first week as interim chairperson unfolded with similar moments of revelation and recalibration. Executives accustomed to Edward's decisive but often impulsive leadership style adjusted to my more methodical approach. Middle managers who had learned to present selectively edited information discovered I expected comprehensive analysis throughout the organization. The message spread. This wasn't merely a titular change, but a substantive shift in leadership philosophy. Victoria Palmer's response to the new reality took an unexpected turn. Rather than resigning immediately as many anticipated, she requested the Cleveland transfer option, effectively removing herself from headquarters while maintaining employment. The decision reflected practical career preservation. At 29, with limited executive experience, her professional options were significantly better within the company than attempting to restart elsewhere with the complicated narrative of her relationship with Edward. Edward himself remained nominally connected through his emeritus status, though he had not appeared at headquarters since the transition announcement. According to Eleanor, he had established temporary residence at his lake house 90 minutes outside the city, physical distance that paralleled his removal from operational authority. Whether Victoria had accompanied him remained unclear and deliberately outside my concern. The most significant early challenge emerged 10 days into my leadership when Westbrook Manufacturing, our second-largest client and one Edward had personally cultivated for over a decade, requested an urgent meeting to discuss relationship continuity under the new organizational structure. The implied uncertainty about maintaining their business under my leadership represented the first major test of client confidence. Melissa Chen offered strategic advice during our now regular evening calls. Client uncertainty following leadership. Transitions is normal, she observed from her own CEO experience, especially with relationships Edward deliberately personalized to enhance his perceived indispensability. Westbrook is particularly concerning, I acknowledged. They represent nearly 14% of annual revenue, and Edward intentionally limited access to their executive team, which creates both challenge and opportunity, Melissa noted with characteristic insight. They're expecting to meet someone unfamiliar with their business, giving you the chance to decisively reset expectations by demonstrating deeper understanding than they anticipate. Following her advice, I spent the weekend immersed in Westbrook's complete account history, not just the summary reports Edward had presented to the board, but the detailed implementation documentation, financial structures, and service evaluations. By Monday morning, I had developed a comprehensive understanding far exceeding the superficial familiarity they would expect from Edward's previously invisible wife. The meeting was scheduled for Wednesday morning, with Westbrook's CEO Robert Campbell and CFO Thomas Winters traveling to our headquarters, a power move suggesting they viewed themselves as the dominant party in our recalibrated relationship. I deliberately selected the main boardroom rather than the intimate conversation space Edward had always used for client meetings, subtly establishing that this discussion would proceed on my terms rather than theirs. When they arrived, Judith escorted them to the boardroom where I waited with James Donovan, our CFO, and Sarah Kendall, whose international expertise was relevant to Westbrook's expansion ambitions. The subtle message was clear. They weren't meeting with an isolated and uncertain new leader, but with a cohesive executive team. "Gentlemen, welcome," I greeted them with professional warmth. "I understand you have questions about our continuing relationship under the leadership transition." Robert Campbell, a man approximately Edward's age who had built his career in the same era of male-dominated manufacturing leadership, made minimal effort to conceal his skepticism. "Catherine, I hope I may call you that," he began with practiced cordiality. "This is obviously a significant change from our long-standing relationship with Edward. We've built considerable business together based on mutual understanding of industry dynamics." The implied concern was typical, that Edward's departure meant loss of the executive relationship they valued, necessitating either their departure to follow him or significant concessions to maintain their business. Their negotiating position assumed my desperation to retain their account would create leverage they could exploit. "Indeed, our companies have built substantial mutual value," I agreed pleasantly, "which is why I wanted to address your supply chain vulnerability concerns before they became more pressing." The statement, referencing internal challenges they hadn't mentioned publicly, visibly startled both men. Their CFO recovered first. "You're familiar with our manufacturing structure?" "Not just familiar, but concerned about the potential material shortages with your current approach," I replied, opening my portfolio to reference specific details. "The single-source dependency for your precision components creates unnecessary exposure under the revised tariff framework taking effect next quarter. We've developed an alternative sourcing structure that maintains quality specifications while reducing supply chain risk by approximately 38%. The substantive analysis, addressing problems they hadn't even raised yet, completely reset the conversation's dynamic. Rather than an obligatory courtesy meeting with Edward's replacement, they found themselves engaged with someone possessing deeper understanding of their business challenges than Edward had ever demonstrated. For the next 2 hours, we discussed detailed aspects of their manufacturing operations, international compliance considerations, and strategic positioning. With each exchange, their initial skepticism visibly transformed into genuine professional engagement. By the meeting's conclusion, Robert Campbell's tone had shifted from condescending evaluation to collegial problem-solving. "I'll be direct. Catherine," he said as we concluded, "we came here expecting to begin transition planning to another provider. Edward had assured us his personal involvement was essential to your company's service model. Clearly, we were misinformed about where the actual expertise resided." The candid acknowledgement represented more than client retention. It was explicit recognition that Edward had deliberately cultivated dependencies to enhance his perceived value while obscuring my contributions. As they departed with renewed commitments rather than termination plans, I recognized this interaction would repeat with other key relationships Edward had personalized to magnify his own importance. As my third week of leadership began, patterns emerged that reflected both organizational recalibration and personal vindication. Executives who had initially approached me with cautious formality began bringing substantive challenges directly to my attention, discovering that my insights often resolved long-standing issues Edward had left unaddressed. Mid-level managers, particularly women who had struggled for recognition, found more receptive consideration of their perspectives than had been possible under previous leadership. 1 month into my leadership of Blackwell Industries, I was reviewing quarterly projections late one evening when James Donovan, our veteran CFO, requested an urgent meeting. His typically composed demeanor showed unusual strain as he entered my office carrying a leather portfolio similar to the one my grandmother had given me decades earlier. "I found something concerning," James began without preamble, placing several documents on my desk. Something Edward had compartmentalized outside normal reporting structures. If you've ever uncovered a problem that someone in power deliberately concealed, hit that subscribe button and notification bell. In Part 6, you'll discover the critical situation Edward had been hiding from the board, how Victoria attempted to leverage it against me, and the unexpected response from Edward when confronted with the potential consequences of his deception. I studied James's face carefully as he arranged the documents before me with methodical precision. In our month of working closely together since I'd assumed leadership, I'd come to appreciate his meticulous approach to financial oversight. The fact that his typically composed demeanor showed visible strain suggested something far beyond routine concerns. "Edward created a separate legal entity 3 years ago," James explained, pointing to incorporation documents bearing an unfamiliar name, Clearwater Holdings. "It appears to be a vehicle for diverting certain high-margin contracts through alternative channels. The structure is technically legal but ethically questionable at best." I examined the papers with growing concern. The entity had been established with minimal capitalization, but had processed over $22 million in transactions during the past fiscal year, all carefully segregated from Blackwell Industries' standard reporting channels. "These contracts should have been executed through our primary business structure," I noted, quickly recognizing familiar client names among the documentation. "Why weren't these flagged during standard auditing procedures?" James's expression tightened. Edward personally oversaw audit engagement parameters. He specifically excluded certain strategic initiatives from standard review, claiming board-level confidentiality. Since he controlled both the board communications and the audit committee assignments, the implication was clear. Edward had used his unquestioned authority to create deliberate blind spots in our oversight mechanisms, establishing a shadow operation that diverted substantial revenue while remaining invisible to normal corporate governance. "Who else knows about this?" I asked, mentally calculating potential organizational exposure. As far as I can determine, access was tightly restricted to Edward himself, Victoria Palmer, and Lawrence Chen in legal, James replied. Lawrence apparently handled the documentation under explicit confidentiality directives. I only discovered this while reviewing historical allocation patterns as part of the transition assessment you requested. Victoria's involvement wasn't surprising, but added significant complexity to the situation. Having transferred to our Cleveland office, she now had potential leverage that could prove problematic if she chose to use it. The most immediate concern is the Westbrook manufacturing contract structure, James continued, highlighting specific pages. Their primary service agreement flows through proper channels, but 3 specialized component contracts were diverted through Clearwater with substantial markup differentials. If they discover this arrangement, the implication was clear. Our largest client relationship, the one I had just personally stabilized, could be severely damaged if they learned they had been subjected to what amounted to concealed double billing through artificially separated entities. The timing creates additional complications, James noted. His voice lowered despite us being alone in my office. The quarterly SEC filings are due in 18 days. These revenue allocations should technically be consolidated, but haven't been historically. Changing approach now raises questions about previous filings. The gravity of the situation crystallized with brutal clarity. Edward hadn't just created a personal slush fund or side business. He had established a structure that now placed the entire company in potential regulatory jeopardy. Failing to disclose these relationships in upcoming filings would perpetuate potential securities violations, while sudden disclosure would trigger inevitable regulatory scrutiny of past reports. We need Eleanor here immediately, I decided, reaching for my phone. And I want Lawrence Chen in my office first thing tomorrow morning. James nodded in agreement. Should we alert the board? I considered the implications carefully. Not yet. I want legal assessment and remediation options before creating wider exposure. For now, this remains compartmentalized. By 9 the following morning, Eleanor Matthews had reviewed the documentation and confirmed our concerns with characteristic bluntness. This presents significant exposure on multiple fronts, she summarized, as Lawrence Chen shifted uncomfortably in his chair across from my desk. Securities filing inconsistencies, client relationship complications, and potential contractual misrepresentations. Lawrence, our 38-year-old associate general counsel, maintained rigidly proper posture but couldn't completely mask his anxiety. I executed the documentation based on direct instruction from Edward as CEO. The structures themselves are legally sound, though I did express concerns about segregated reporting. Expressing concerns isn't the same as ensuring compliance, Eleanor noted pointedly. As counsel, your obligation extends beyond simply following instructions when potential regulatory issues are evident. Rather than allowing this to devolve into accusation, I redirected focus to immediate priorities. Our primary concern is addressing this appropriately without creating unnecessary damage. Lawrence, I need complete transparency. What else exists that we haven't yet identified? His hesitation spoke volumes before he finally responded. There's a similar arrangement with Meridian Solutions, though smaller in scale, and preliminary documentation for a parallel structure focused on our Asian operations, though I believe that wasn't fully implemented before. He paused awkwardly. Before recent leadership changes. The reference to Edward's abrupt departure and my assumption of control hung in the air. It seemed Edward had been systematically expanding these shadow arrangements until our confrontation had interrupted his plans. We need comprehensive remediation strategies, I instructed, looking between Eleanor and James. Options for immediate disclosure, structured reconciliation, client relationship management, and regulatory engagement if necessary. Eleanor nodded briskly. I'll have preliminary approaches by end of day. The cleanest path involves full disclosure with voluntary remediation, though timing and messaging require careful consideration. As they departed to begin this urgent work, I remained alone in what had been Edward's office, contemplating the cascading implications. The company I had just assumed control of faced potential regulatory investigation, client defections, and public reputation damage, all from arrangements Edward had deliberately concealed from normal oversight. The irony wasn't lost on me. After decades of being underestimated, I had finally secured control of Blackwell Industries, only to discover Edward had embedded a potential crisis that might severely damage the company's value and viability. As I contemplated next steps, my phone signaled an incoming message from Victoria Palmer. The timing seemed unlikely to be coincidental. "We should discuss Clearwater Holdings. Dinner at Verano tonight, 7 p.m.? The message confirmed my suspicion that Victoria was fully aware of these arrangements and recognized their potential value as leverage. Her choice of Verano, an upscale restaurant where Edward had often entertained clients, suggested she was positioning this as a negotiation between equals rather than a conversation with her organizational superior. My response was deliberately neutral. "My office, 3 p.m. today." Establishing the location within the corporate headquarters rather than an external venue was deliberate, a clear signal that this would be a business discussion governed by organizational hierarchies, not a private negotiation. Victoria arrived. Precisely at 3 p.m., her composed professionalism masking whatever calculation had prompted her outreach. I had arranged for Eleanor to join us, establishing an additional layer of formality and witness to whatever might transpire. "Thank you for making time to meet," Victoria began with practiced cordiality once we were seated at the small conference table in my office, rather than the more casual seating area. "There are aspects of certain strategic arrangements that probably warrant discussion during this transition period." "You're referring to the Clearwater Holdings structures," I replied directly, observing her reaction closely. "We've identified the arrangements with Westbrook and Meridian. Is there anything else we should be aware of?" The directness appeared to momentarily disrupt her prepared approach. She had likely anticipated need for leverage to extract information I already possessed. "Those are the primary active engagements," she confirmed after slight hesitation. The Asia-Pacific framework was still in development stages. Eleanor maintained professional silence, but watched the exchange with analytical attention, occasionally making brief notes. "What exactly did you hope to achieve with this meeting, Victoria?" I asked, cutting through the preliminary maneuvering. She straightened almost imperceptibly, recalibrating her approach. "I have comprehensive documentation regarding these arrangements, including Edward's strategic rationale and implementation directives. Given the potential sensitivities involved, I thought a private conversation about mutual interests would be appropriate." The implied threat was thinly veiled. She possessed information that could be damaging if released inappropriately, and was suggesting accommodation of her interests in exchange for cooperation. "To be absolutely clear," I replied with deliberate calm, "are you suggesting you have information you believe might be valuable in addressing these accounting irregularities, and you're seeking some form of consideration for your cooperation?" Victoria's expression tightened at this explicit framing. "I'm simply offering to provide context that might prove helpful during this transition. My continued career development within the organization is naturally of interest as these discussions proceed." Eleanor chose this moment to interject. "Ms. Palmer, as outside counsel, I should note that any documentation related to Blackwell Industries operations remains company property regardless of who physically possesses it. Additionally, any attempt to leverage such materials for personal benefit could potentially raise serious legal concerns." The attorney's measured warning shifted the conversation's dynamic. Victoria's leverage position had presumed information, a symmetry that no longer existed, and her implied negotiating strategy now carried risks she hadn't anticipated. "My interest is solely in ensuring organizational stability," Victoria replied, her tone noticeably more cautious. I believed my direct knowledge of these arrangements might be valuable in addressing any transitional questions. We appreciate that perspective, I acknowledged, offering a measured path forward. I'd like you to provide complete documentation to Lawrence Chen by close of business tomorrow, after which we can discuss appropriate next steps regarding your role within the organization. The message was clear. Cooperation was expected as a basic employment obligation, not a negotiable asset. Whatever leverage Victoria had imagined from her knowledge of Edward's arrangements had evaporated with our already existing awareness, and the formal legal context Eleanor had established. After Victoria departed, Eleanor raised a questioning eyebrow. "Do you believe she'll cooperate?" "She's ambitious but practical," I assessed. Her calculated approach suggests she recognizes value in corporate advancement over short-term leverage. More concerning is what this reveals about Edward's ongoing influence. He's clearly still communicating with her, likely encouraging this approach. Which raises the question of his next move, Eleanor noted thoughtfully. These arrangements carry potential personal liability for him beyond corporate exposure. His awareness that we've discovered them changes his strategic position considerably. By the following morning, our crisis management approach was taking shape. Eleanor had prepared 3 potential remediation strategies, each with different balances of disclosure, risk management, and business continuity considerations. James had assembled a comprehensive financial impact assessment, while Lawrence Chen had provided complete documentation of all Clearwater Holdings transactions, more extensive than initially identified. Surprisingly, Victoria had delivered her materials to Lawrence as instructed, including email communications with Edward that revealed more about his strategic intentions than I had anticipated. These records showed Edward had been systematically preparing to separate valuable portions of Blackwell Industries' business into structures where he maintained independent control, effectively creating a shadow company that could potentially compete with or undermine the primary organization I now led. "The pattern is concerning," Eleanor observed as we reviewed these materials in my office. "These weren't simply accounting maneuvers for tax advantages. This appears to be deliberate groundwork for extracting core business components, which raises questions about his long-term intentions," I noted, connecting pieces that now formed a disturbing picture. His relationship with Victoria and planned departure from our marriage coincided with accelerated development of these separate entities. He wasn't simply leaving me for a younger woman. He was preparing to abandon the company while taking its most valuable components with him. James nodded grimly. "The timing aligns. The most aggressive expansion of these arrangements began approximately 14 months ago, shortly after Victoria's promotion to executive assistant. This revelation transformed my understanding of Edward's actions. What I had perceived as merely personal betrayal now appeared to be part of a calculated business strategy, using our marriage as convenient cover while he systematically positioned assets for extraction, likely planning to emerge with Victoria as his partner in both personal and professional realms once the maneuver was complete. Our immediate concern is regulatory compliance," Eleanor redirected pragmatically. "The quarterly filing deadline doesn't allow for extended deliberation. I recommend the structured disclosure approach, acknowledging the previously separate entities, consolidating them appropriately, and noting the ongoing internal governance review. That creates significant stock volatility risk," James cautioned. "Markets respond poorly to unexpected accounting adjustments, particularly when governance questions are involved. The alternative is perpetuating potentially misleading filings," Eleanor countered, "which carries far greater long-term consequences. I considered our options carefully. We proceed with full consolidation and appropriate disclosure. James, prepare comprehensive materials for an emergency board meeting tomorrow." "Morning." They need to understand both the situation and our remediation approach before public disclosure. As they departed to execute these directives, my phone signaled an incoming call from an unexpected source, Edward himself, After a month of complete separation following the transition, his sudden outreach suggested he had learned of our discoveries. Catherine. His voice carried forced casualness when I answered. I've been thinking we should discuss certain operational arrangements that might not have been fully documented during the transition. You're referring to Clearwater Holdings, I replied directly, and the various contractual diversions through that entity. His momentary silence confirmed my directness had disrupted his planned approach. I see Victoria has been in contact, he finally responded, attempting to reframe the situation. Though I'd hoped to address this directly before any misunderstandings developed. This isn't about Victoria, I corrected firmly. This is about systematic financial arrangements you deliberately concealed from standard reporting and governance oversight. Arrangements that have created significant regulatory exposure for the company. Another pause. These were strategic innovations to optimize certain client relationship values, he offered, his explanation sounding hollow even to my skeptical ear. I'd be happy to walk you through the strategic rationale behind these structures. Perhaps over dinner this evening? The suggestion that this could be resolved through a private social engagement rather than formal business channels revealed Edward's fundamental misunderstanding of our new reality. He still believed in his ability to manage perceptions through personal charm and private manipulation, approaches that had worked for him throughout his career but were now entirely inappropriate. We have an emergency board meeting scheduled for tomorrow morning, I informed him. As emeritus chairman with observer privileges, you're entitled to attend. That would be the appropriate venue for any explanations you wish to provide regarding these arrangements. Catherine. His tone shifted to the authoritative resonance he had used throughout our marriage when asserting control. I strongly advise against escalating this to the board before we've had opportunity to align our understanding. There are nuances here that require careful consideration. The SEC filing deadline requires immediate board engagement, I replied calmly. The meeting is at 9 a.m. in the main boardroom. Your participation is optional, but might prove beneficial to your interests given the potential implications. After ending the call, I contacted Melissa Chen to brief her privately ahead of the board meeting. As our newest and most independent board member, her perspective would carry particular weight with the others. Not entirely surprising, she commented after I outlined the situation. The personality traits that drive entrepreneurial success, control orientation, rule-bending tendencies, expansive self-belief, often express themselves in these types of arrangements when left unchecked by appropriate governance. The challenge is containing the damage while maintaining operational continuity, I acknowledged. The key is framing, Melissa advised from her own crisis management experience. This needs to be presented as discovered historical issues being promptly addressed by new leadership, not ongoing organizational failure. The narrative must emphasize remediation rather than culpability. Her strategic guidance proved invaluable the following morning when 7 board members gathered in the main boardroom, expressions ranging from concern to alarm as they reviewed the materials James had prepared. Edward had chosen to attend as well, positioned at the far end of the table in deliberate physical separation from my position at the head. As the materials outline, I began once everyone had reviewed the documentation. We've identified non-standard contractual arrangements through a separate legal entity that require immediate address for appropriate financial consolidation and regulatory compliance. Richard Bennett, Edward's longest-serving board ally, leaned forward with visible discomfort. These arrangements were never presented to the board for review or approval. Edward, can you explain the governance process here? Edward maintained composed professionalism despite the clear challenge. These were specialized strategic structures developed under my authority as CEO. The arrangements themselves are entirely legal and designed to optimize certain client relationship values while creating appropriate positioning for international expansion. Melissa Chen's response was measured but direct. Legal structure isn't the primary concern. The issue is segregated reporting that created incomplete financial representation and potential regulatory misalignment. As directors, our fiduciary responsibility requires immediate remediation regardless of original intent. Her framing, focusing on correction rather than blame, established precisely the tone I had hoped to achieve. Other board members visibly responded to this approach, their expressions shifting from accusatory to problem-solving orientation. The key 4-hour meeting that followed was among the most challenging of my professional life. We methodically examined each arrangement, assessed potential exposure, and deliberated appropriate remediation steps. Edward attempted several times to minimize the significance of these structures or to characterize them as standard industry practices, but Melissa's experience in corporate governance allowed her to systematically counter these assertions with reference to specific regulatory standards. By early afternoon, the board had unanimously approved our proposed approach: full financial consolidation, transparent disclosure in the upcoming quarterly filing, engagement with an independent accounting firm for comprehensive review, and proactive outreach to affected clients to address potential relationship concerns. As the meeting concluded and board members filtered out, Edward remained seated, his expression revealing calculations I recognized from decades of watching him assess challenging business situations. Once we were alone, he leaned forward with uncharacteristic directness. "What exactly are you trying to accomplish here, Catherine?" he asked, genuine curiosity evident beneath his defensive posture. "Protecting the company while ensuring appropriate governance and compliance," I replied simply. "The same responsibilities you would have in my position." He shook his head slightly. "This level of disclosure creates unnecessary scrutiny. These arrangements could have been quietly unwound over time without drawing regulatory attention or client concern." "That approach might protect your reputation," I acknowledged, "but would perpetuate potential liability for the company and the board. My responsibility is to the organization, not to personal considerations." Something shifted in his expression, a momentary glimpse of genuine respect breaking through his defensive armor. "You've always been more principled than practical," he noted, though without his usual dismissiveness. "It's admirable, but creates complications that could be avoided." Principles and pragmatism aren't mutually exclusive, I countered. Addressing these issues directly is ultimately more practical than allowing potential regulatory violations to persist. As Edward rose to leave, he paused briefly. "Victoria believes you're deliberately using this situation to dismantle what I built. Is that your intention?" The question revealed more about their continuing communication than about my actions. "My intention is to lead this company effectively while addressing issues that threaten its stability," I replied. "The fact that some of those issues originated in your decisions doesn't make addressing them personal." After Edward's departure, I remained alone in the boardroom, contemplating the challenges still ahead. The technical aspects of financial consolidation and disclosure were straightforward compared to the relationship management required with clients who would inevitably question these revelations. My phone signaled an incoming message from Melissa. "Handled masterfully. Looking for dinner at 6? Will bring potential crisis management firm recommendation." Her support and practical guidance had proven invaluable throughout this process. As I confirmed our dinner plans, I realized how different this professional friendship was from anything I had experienced during decades as Edward's wife in business settings. For the first time, I was engaging as a recognized business leader in my own right, rather than through the reflected authority of my husband. The distinction wasn't merely personal validation. It represented a fundamental shift in how I could now operate within the business landscape. The very competencies Edward had minimized were now recognized as valuable leadership qualities, creating opportunities for genuine collaboration rather than behind-the-scenes influence. The morning after our board meeting, the Blackwell Industries press release went public, a carefully crafted statement acknowledging the discovery of previously segregated contractual arrangements, now being appropriately consolidated under new leadership governance. The language Eleanor had developed walked the delicate line between necessary disclosure and catastrophic revelation, emphasizing remediation rather than wrongdoing. Market reaction was immediate but contained. Our stock dropped 12% in early trading, before stabilizing at approximately 8% below previous close. A significant impact, but far from the devastating collapse that could have occurred with less strategic disclosure. Financial analysts issued cautious statements, noting leadership transition challenges, while acknowledging the apparent transparency of current management in addressing historical issues. More concerning was client reaction. By mid-morning, 4 of our top 20 clients had requested emergency meetings to discuss relationship continuity with Westbrook Manufacturing, our most significant account, demanding immediate clarification regarding their contractual structures specifically. "We need a coordinated client engagement strategy," I noted during our emergency executive team meeting. "James, prepare comprehensive reconciliation reports for each affected client, showing exactly how their previous arrangements will be appropriately restructured, without service disruption." Sarah Kendall, our international operations head who had emerged as a key ally, offered valuable perspective. "This is fundamentally about trust, not just contracts. Each client needs personal reassurance that these issues reflected past leadership decisions being corrected, not ongoing organizational dysfunction." Her insight shaped our response approach. Rather than delegating these sensitive conversations to account managers, our executive team divided responsibility for direct engagement with each affected client. I personally contacted Robert Campbell at Westbrook Manufacturing, scheduling an in-person meeting for the following morning. "We have a potential complication," James reported later that afternoon, looking up from his computer with visible concern. "Edward appears to be conducting parallel outreach to several key clients, including Westbrook." This development wasn't entirely surprising, but created significant challenges for our stabilization efforts. Edward's emeritus status gave him continued legitimacy with long-standing clients, allowing him to potentially undermine our remediation narrative with his own interpretation of events. "What exactly is he communicating?" I asked, mentally preparing contingencies. According to what Robert Campbell shared with our account director, Edward is characterizing these arrangements as standard industry practices being misrepresented by inexperienced leadership. He's suggesting clients could face service disruptions unless these structures are maintained through alternative mechanisms he's developing. The implication was clear. Edward was leveraging client uncertainty to potentially migrate key relationships to new entities he controlled, effectively executing the very extraction strategy our discovery had interrupted. This requires direct counteraction, I decided immediately. We need documentation demonstrating exactly how these arrangements diverged from industry standards and the specific regulatory vulnerabilities they created. Eleanor should prepare supporting materials from outside accounting and legal perspectives that clearly establish appropriate business practice boundaries. By that evening, we had compiled comprehensive packets for each affected client, contrasting Edward's non-standard arrangements with proper industry practices using objective third-party standards. These materials would accompany our personal outreach, providing factual counterbalance to Edward's characterizations. My dinner with Melissa Chen that evening proved invaluable for developing strategic perspective beyond immediate crisis management. Edward's approach is predictable but short-sighted, she observed as we reviewed our response strategy. By attempting to extract clients through questionable characterizations, he's creating potential liability for himself beyond whatever new ventures he's planning. The challenge is managing client relationships through this uncertainty, I acknowledged. Many of these executives have decades-long personal connections with Edward built on golf outings and expensive dinners. Those social bonds can sometimes outweigh objective business considerations. Melissa's response reflected her characteristically strategic thinking. That presents opportunity as well as challenge. Those relationships were built on Edward's persona, the charismatic leader making promises over cocktails. You can offer something more substantive, the person who actually structured the operational solutions they've benefited from for years. Her framing crystallized my approach for the following day's meeting with Westbrook Manufacturing. Rather than competing with Edward's established relationship model, I would demonstrate an entirely different value proposition built on transparency, operational expertise, and substantive business partnership. When Robert Campbell and Thomas Winters arrived at our headquarters the next morning, I had arranged for the meeting to occur not in a formal conference room, but in our Technical Operations Center, the environment where their actual manufacturing integration systems were monitored and supported. I thought it would be valuable to discuss these matters where the real work happens rather than in a boardroom, I explained as they appeared momentarily disoriented by the unexpected setting. The issues we're addressing aren't abstract financial structures, but practical business operations that affect your manufacturing capabilities. The environment shift immediately changed the conversation's dynamic. Rather than an executive relationship discussion, we were literally surrounded by the technical systems their business depended upon, systems I understood in detail, while Edward had always delegated their comprehension to others. I'll be direct. Robert, I began once we were seated amidst the operational displays. The arrangements Edward established created artificial separation between contract components that should have been integrated. This wasn't just an accounting issue. It created unnecessary complexity in your technical support infrastructure and potentially compromised system optimization. Using the large monitoring screens surrounding us, I demonstrated exactly how their manufacturing integration systems had been fragmented across different contractual structures, highlighting inefficiencies this approach had created in their operational support. This segregation served no legitimate business purpose for your operations, I explained, highlighting specific technical implications. It created artificial barriers between system components that should function as integrated units, requiring duplicate protocols and redundant security oversight. Thomas Winters, their technically oriented CFO, leaned forward with growing interest as I detailed these implications. We've been experiencing precisely these integration challenges between component systems. Our technical team identified the barriers but couldn't determine why they existed structurally. Because the purpose wasn't technical efficiency, I acknowledged candidly. The structures were designed for different objectives that didn't prioritize your operational optimization. By focusing on tangible operational impacts rather than abstract financial arrangements, I had redirected the conversation from Edward's relationship-based assurances to measurable business value considerations that directly affected their manufacturing capabilities. Over the next 2 hours, we methodically reviewed how consolidating these artificially separated components would eliminate unnecessary complexity while enhancing system performance and security. The technical staff I had included in the meeting demonstrated specific integration improvements already implemented during our remediation efforts. As our discussion concluded, Robert Campbell's perspective had visibly shifted from suspicion to cautious optimism. I spoke with Edward yesterday, he acknowledged directly. He suggested these changes might disrupt our service arrangements and recommended consideration of alternative structures he's developing. And what's your assessment after today's discussion? I asked, deliberately keeping my tone neutral despite the confirmation of Edward's interference. My assessment, Robert replied thoughtfully, is that we've apparently been operating with unnecessary complications for some time. If consolidating these arrangements enhances our system integration while maintaining regulatory compliance, that represents clear improvement over previous structures. This pattern repeated throughout the week as our executive team conducted similar engagements with affected clients. By focusing on tangible operational benefits rather than competing directly with Edward's relationship-based approach, we successfully stabilized 18 of our 20 key client relationships. The remaining 2 indicated they would evaluate options, including Edward's alternatives, before making definitive commitments. While managing this external stabilization, we simultaneously addressed internal organizational impacts. The quarterly filing proceeded as planned with appropriate consolidation and disclosure, triggering expected regulatory inquiries, but avoiding more severe compliance consequences that could have resulted from continued concealment. More challenging was addressing the cultural uncertainty these revelations created throughout the organization. Employees who had viewed Edward as the embodiment of company values now questioned their understanding of the organization they served, creating potential morale and retention concerns if not properly addressed. We need a comprehensive internal communication approach, Sarah Kendall advised during our strategy session. Not just explaining what happened, but re-establishing organizational values and direction under your leadership. This insight led to a series of town hall meetings where I spoke directly with employee groups across the organization, addressing questions with candid transparency, while articulating a vision for Blackwell Industries built on integrity, operational excellence, and collaborative innovation, rather than charismatic individual leadership. By the third week, following our discovery and disclosure, operational stability had largely returned despite considerable ongoing challenges. The stock price had recovered. Approximately 60% of its initial decline as market observers responded positively to our transparent remediation approach. Client relationships had stabilized, with only the 2 undecided accounts still evaluating alternatives. It was amid this fragile recovery that Victoria Palmer made her unexpected return to headquarters, requesting a private meeting through formal channels rather than the direct approach she had attempted previously. "I appreciate you agreeing to meet," she began when we convened in my office, her demeanor noticeably different from our previous interaction. Less calculated, more genuinely reflective. "I've been reconsidering my professional position and future direction." "I assume this relates to Edward's current activities," I observed, having received reports that he was actively establishing new business entities with objectives that appeared designed to compete with or extract value from Blackwell Industries. Victoria nodded slightly. "He's been developing alternative structures for several key client relationships. I was initially involved in those efforts but have become concerned about certain aspects of the approach." Her hesitation suggested more significant reservations than she was directly expressing. "What specific concerns have developed?" I asked, watching her response carefully. "The representations being made to potential clients," she replied after a momentary consideration. "Some assertions about service. Capabilities and operational infrastructure seem inconsistent with actual development status. As someone who would be responsible for delivering on those commitments," she didn't need to complete the thought. Victoria was facing the reality that Edward's promises to clients likely couldn't be fulfilled through whatever new entities he was hastily assembling, creating professional liability for those associated with these representations. "I see," I acknowledged, considering the implications of her apparent disillusionment with Edward's approach. "And what outcome are you hoping for from this conversation?" "I'd like to discuss the possibility of returning to my original position at headquarters," she stated directly. "I believe my experience and capabilities could be valuable during this stabilization period, particularly regarding client relationships where I have established connections." Victoria's request presented a complex strategic question. Her knowledge of client relationships and Edward's operations could prove valuable during our stabilization efforts. But her previous alignment with Edward, both personally and professionally, created legitimate trust concerns. Her sudden reversal suggested either genuine reconsideration or calculated repositioning as Edward's plans appeared increasingly unstable. Before discussing potential return arrangements, I responded carefully, "I need to understand what's changed beyond concerns about Edward's representations to clients. Your previous actions suggested different priorities." Victoria maintained direct eye contact, something I'd noted she did deliberately during important negotiations. "What's changed is my understanding of sustainable business development. Edward's Approach prioritizes immediate relationship leverage over viable operational foundations. That creates short-term opportunities but long-term vulnerability, professionally and personally. Her assessment wasn't wrong. Edward had always emphasized relationship cultivation and deal closure over operational infrastructure, relying on others, primarily me, to transform his promises into functional business systems. In establishing his new ventures, he appeared to be replicating this approach without the behind-the-scenes support that had previously made it viable. "And your personal relationship status?" I asked, the question relevant to organizational dynamics rather than mere curiosity. "That's evolved as well," she acknowledged with measured professionalism. As business development challenges emerged, other concerning patterns became evident. "I've separated my living arrangements and maintained only professional contact for the past 2 weeks." This revelation aligned with intelligence we'd received that Edward had been increasingly erratic in client interactions, making expansive promises while displaying growing frustration when questioned about implementation details. Without Victoria's organizational capabilities and my operational expertise, his characteristic charm was proving insufficient to sustain complex business relationships. "I appreciate your candor," I replied. "However, your return would require several specific conditions. First, you would report directly to Sarah Kendall rather than holding independent position authority. Second, all client communications would require review and approval through established channels. Third, you would need to provide comprehensive documentation of Edward's current business development activities, including client targeting, service representations, and proposed operational structures. The third condition was the most revealing test of her actual intentions. If Victoria was genuinely separating from Edward's approach, she would recognize the business necessity of this disclosure. If she remained aligned with his interests, this requirement would likely trigger immediate rejection. Victoria considered these terms with measured thoughtfulness. The reporting structure and communication protocols are reasonable given the circumstances. Regarding documentation of Edward's activities, I can provide what I have direct access to, though some materials remain in his exclusive possession. Would partial documentation be acceptable with the understanding that it represents what I can legitimately access? Her response suggested genuine willingness to establish appropriate boundaries while acknowledging realistic limitations, a pragmatic approach that increased my confidence in her sincerity. That would be acceptable, provided the materials are substantive rather than peripheral, I agreed. We'll establish a 90-day provisional arrangement with formal review at 30-day intervals. Performance expectations will be clearly documented, with continuation contingent on meeting specific metrics including complete adherence to communication protocols. The structured terms established clear parameters while providing opportunity to demonstrate legitimate value contribution. Victoria accepted these conditions without further negotiation, another indication of potentially genuine professional recalibration rather than strategic maneuvering on Edward's behalf. After she departed, I briefed Eleanor and Sarah on this development, with Sarah expressing measured skepticism about Victoria's motivations. "This could be valuable intelligence access," Sarah acknowledged, "but also creates risk of internal disruption or information leakage. Her previous loyalty to Edward warrants significant caution. Which is why I've established the provisional structure reporting directly to you," I explained. "Your assessment of her actual contributions and adherence to protocols will determine whether this arrangement continues beyond the initial review period." Eleanor approached the situation with characteristic legal pragmatism. Having her inside, our information perimeter with appropriate monitoring presents less risk than having her operating independently with Edward. The documentation she's promised could prove particularly valuable in addressing our 2 remaining uncertain client relationships. By the following week, Victoria had returned to headquarters under the established arrangement. The materials she provided regarding Edward's nascent competitive ventures proved substantively valuable, revealing client targeting strategies, operational representations, and financial projections that appeared increasingly detached from implementable Reality. Most concerning were materials showing Edward actively recruiting key personnel from Blackwell Industries to join his new entities, targeting individuals with client relationship access or specialized technical knowledge critical to our core operations. These recruitment efforts included significant equity offerings and dramatic title inflations, vice president positions for mid-level managers, chief innovation officer roles for technical specialists, leveraging ego and ambition rather than sustainable business fundamentals. This presents specific vulnerability we need to address proactively, I determined during our executive strategy session. James, develop enhanced retention packages for key personnel identified in these materials. Sarah, implement knowledge transfer protocols to reduce single-person dependencies in critical operational areas. Beyond these defensive measures, Victoria's intelligence allowed us to develop proactive counter-strategies with the two clients still evaluating Edward's alternative proposals. Rather than competing directly with his relationship-based approach, we demonstrated specific technical capabilities his nascent ventures couldn't possibly deliver despite his representations. This strategy proved effective as both remaining clients ultimately recommitted to Blackwell Industries after observing the implementation gap between Edward's promises and his actual delivery capacity. His characteristic charm and expansive vision, previously supplemented by organizational capabilities he no longer controlled, proved insufficient against concrete operational demonstrations. As we entered the second month following our discovery and disclosure of the irregular financial arrangements, external stabilization had largely been achieved. Our stock had recovered almost completely as market observers responded to our transparent remediation and client retention success. Regulatory inquiries continued, but had shifted from investigative to monitoring orientation based on our proactive disclosure and structured resolution approach. More challenging was the internal cultural transformation necessary to establish sustainable leadership differentiated from Edward's personality-driven approach. For decades, Blackwell Industries' identity had been inextricably linked with Edward's charismatic presence. Creating a distinct organizational culture based on operational excellence and collaborative innovation, rather than individual authority, required deliberate, consistent reinforcement throughout daily operations. We need to institutionalize decision-making, processes that previously resided in Edward's informal authority, I explained during our executive planning session. Not by creating bureaucratic barriers, but by establishing transparent frameworks that distribute appropriate authority while maintaining accountability. This approach manifested in practical structural changes, decision matrices clearly documenting approval requirements, collaborative problem-solving frameworks replacing individual authority dictates, performance metrics emphasizing team outcomes, alongside individual contributions. These mechanisms institutionalized operational excellence principles that had previously existed only through my behind-the-scenes influence on Edward's more intuitive directives. 6 weeks into this transformation process, we received unexpected information through Victoria's monitoring role. Edward had scheduled meetings with several significant private equity firms, apparently seeking substantial investment to accelerate his competitive ventures beyond what his personal resources could support. This represents potential escalation, beyond what we've previously anticipated, Eleanor warned during our strategy discussion. Private equity backing would provide resources for more aggressive recruitment and client acquisition efforts. The timing seems premature given his current operational capabilities, James observed. What exactly is he presenting to these potential investors? Victoria provided insight based on materials she had legitimate access to from her previous involvement. He's developed comprehensive presentation materials emphasizing his historical success building Blackwell Industries, projecting similar growth trajectories for his new ventures. The materials suggest more developed operational infrastructure than actually exists, with implementation timelines that appear highly optimistic based on current development status. The implications were concerning from both competitive and ethical perspectives. If Edwards secured substantial investment based on misrepresentations of operational readiness, he could potentially accelerate competitive threats against Blackwell Industries while simultaneously creating investor fraud exposure for himself and any associates involved in these representations. This creates complex considerations, Eleanor noted thoughtfully. While protecting Blackwell Industries remains our primary responsibility, allowing investors to commit significant resources based on potentially misleading representations creates broader market integrity concerns. The ethical complexity reflected fundamental differences between Edwards' approach to business development and the principles I was establishing as Blackwell Industries' new leadership foundation. Edwards' characteristic strategy had always involved selling vision first, then addressing implementation challenges after commitment had been secured. In the past, my behind-the-scenes operational capabilities had made his approach viable by transforming promises into deliverable reality. Without that supporting infrastructure, his familiar pattern now risked crossing from ambitious projection into potential misrepresentation. We need to address this situation carefully, I determined after considering various options. Direct intervention regarding his investor presentations would appear self-serving and potentially vindictive. However, we can ensure market transparency regarding our own intellectual property and operational capabilities that might be incorrectly represented in his materials. This approach led to a carefully crafted public announcement regarding Blackwell Industries' proprietary technologies, implementation methodologies, and client integration systems, establishing clear documentation of resources that remained exclusively within our organization rather than transferable to Edwards' new ventures. While not directly addressing his investor presentations, this created public record that sophisticated investors would recognize as materially relevant to evaluating his projections. The strategy proved effective when two of the three private equity firms Edward had engaged postponed further discussions pending additional operational verification, according to intelligence Victoria provided through appropriate channels. Without significant external investment, Edwards' competitive ventures remained limited to whatever resources he could personally commit, substantially reducing the immediate competitive threat. As we approached the third month following our initial discovery and disclosure, Blackwell Industries had achieved remarkable stabilization. Client relationships had strengthened through our transparent remediation and enhanced integration capabilities. Stock value had fully recovered and begun modest growth as market confidence in our leadership approach solidified. Regulatory matters had transitioned to routine monitoring rather than active investigation. More significantly, internal cultural transformation was showing measurable progress. Decision-making processes that previously required Edwards' personal approval now functioned efficiently through established frameworks. Collaborative problem-solving had replaced individual authority dictates in addressing operational challenges. Performance metrics emphasized team outcomes alongside individual contributions, creating more balanced incentive structures throughout the organization. It was amid this organizational stabilization that I received an unexpected message from Edward requesting a private meeting regarding matters of mutual interest. The timing seemed significant, occurring shortly after his private equity discussions had stalled, and several key recruitment targets had declined his offers to join his new ventures. This could represent strategic recalibration on his part, Eleanor observed when I consulted her regarding this outreach. The viability challenges facing his independent ventures may be forcing reassessment of his overall approach. Or it could be tactical maneuvering to gather intelligence or create disruption, James cautioned from his more skeptical perspective. His previous actions suggest limited concern for organizational impacts when pursuing personal objectives. Both perspectives held merit given Edwards' history. His business approach had always blended genuine strategic vision with personal aggrandizement, making his motivations difficult to categorize as purely constructive or destructive. I'll meet with him, I decided, after considering options. Not at his suggested location, but at headquarters with appropriate documentation of any discussions. Whatever his intentions, Direct engagement provides better assessment than speculation. The meeting was scheduled for the following afternoon, creating 24 hours to prepare for whatever agenda Edward might pursue. After 4 decades of marriage and business partnership, I understood his strategic tendencies better than anyone, yet found myself genuinely uncertain what approach he would take in our current unprecedented circumstances. I arrived at our meeting 15 minutes early, deliberately, selecting the executive conference room rather than my office. The more neutral territory would subtly prevent Edward from falling into familiar patterns associated with the space that had been his domain for decades. Eleanor had arranged for comprehensive documentation of our discussion, with both audio, recording, and a senior legal associate positioned unobtrusively in the corner to maintain contemporaneous notes. Edward arrived precisely on time, his characteristic punctuality a constant throughout both our marriage and business relationship. Despite the personal and professional turbulence of recent months, he appeared outwardly composed, expertly tailored suit, confident posture, the carefully constructed image of success he had always prioritized projecting regardless of underlying realities. "Catherine," he greeted me with practiced cordiality, taking the seat across from me rather than attempting to claim the head position he would have automatically assumed in the past. "Thank you for agreeing to meet." "Of course," I responded professionally. "You mentioned matters of mutual interest. I'm curious about the specific topics you wish to discuss." Direct engagement rather than social preliminaries had always been my preferred approach, though Edward had typically insisted on relationship cultivation before substantive business discussions. Today, however, he accepted the immediate focus, on purpose without his usual deflection to personal charm. "I've been reflecting on recent developments," he began, his tone measured. "The challenges of establishing new ventures have provided interesting perspective on what we built together at Blackwell Industries. There's value in that foundation that I perhaps underappreciated." The acknowledgement was significant, coming from someone who had consistently positioned himself as the singular architect of organizational success. Whether this represented genuine reflection or tactical positioning remained unclear. Business foundations require substantial investment to build and maintain, I observed neutrally. That's particularly true for the operational infrastructure that supports client relationships. Edward nodded slightly, acknowledging the implicit reference to his current implementation challenges. "Precisely, which leads to potential opportunity for mutual benefit that I'd like to propose." He placed a leather portfolio on the table, similar to but newer than the one my grandmother had given me decades earlier. The parallel wasn't lost on me as he methodically arranged several documents. Before continuing, "I've developed comprehensive framework for new market expansion, focusing on specialized industrial applications," he explained, pushing the materials toward me. "The approach leverages established client relationships with innovative service delivery models that could substantially enhance value proposition for both existing and new clients." The presentation was quintessential Edward, visionary conceptualization with limited operational specificity. In the past, I would have automatically filled implementation gaps with practical structures while he received credit for strategic vision. That familiar pattern had defined our relationship for 40 years, with Edward's strategic concepts repeatedly transformed into viable business reality through my unacknowledged operational expertise. "And what exactly are you proposing?" I asked, leaving the materials untouched before me. "Strategic partnership," he replied with characteristic confidence. "Blackwell Industries provides operational infrastructure and implementation capabilities. My new venture contributes market positioning and relationship access. Revenue sharing based on relative contribution value. Simple, elegant approach leveraging complementary strengths." The proposal was remarkable in what it revealed about Edward's current reality. After decades defining himself through independent authority and unquestioned control, he was effectively offering subordinate collaboration, tacit acknowledgement. that his independent ventures lacked viability without the operational capabilities I now controlled. "This represents significant evolution from your previous positioning," I observed, maintaining neutral professional tone rather than highlighting the ironic role reversal. Edward responded with unexpected candor. "Reality has informative properties, when properly acknowledged. My strengths remain relationship development and strategic positioning. Implementation capabilities require substantial infrastructure development that duplicates resources you already control. Business fundamentals suggest partnership rather than competitive redundancy. The practical assessment showed pragmatic adaptation I hadn't anticipated. Edward had always preferred maintaining control illusions over acknowledging practical limitations, a trait that had defined both his business approach and our marriage. This apparent willingness to acknowledge interdependency represented either genuine personal evolution or desperate tactical necessity. "The proposal has interesting conceptual elements," I acknowledged, finally reviewing the materials he had provided. "However, implementation would require substantial due diligence regarding alignment with our established governance and compliance frameworks." My response maintained professional engagement without premature commitment, a balanced approach that neither rejected potential business value nor ignored significant trust complications created by recent history. "Understood completely," Edward nodded, surprising me again with his acceptance of appropriate oversight rather than insistence on exceptional treatment. "Comprehensive due diligence is entirely reasonable given historical context. I'm prepared to provide complete transparency regarding all aspects of proposed arrangement." As our discussion progressed through specific elements of his proposal, I observed subtle but significant shifts in Edward's approach. He listened more attentively than in past interactions, acknowledged operational complexities he would previously have dismissed as unnecessary details, and demonstrated unexpected receptiveness to governance considerations he had historically viewed as bureaucratic obstacles. "Your perspective on implementation sequencing is well taken," he conceded, after I identified several critical operational dependencies his timeline had overlooked. "That's precisely the practical expertise that would make partnership more effective than parallel development." Whether these changes represented genuine growth or merely tactical adaptation remained uncertain, though the distinction held important implications for potential collaboration viability. I had known Edward long enough to recognize his capacity for temporary behavioral modification when pursuing specific objectives, changes that typically reverted once goals were secured. After 90 minutes of substantive discussion, I outlined next steps with deliberate precision. "We'll conduct comprehensive analysis of the proposed framework focusing on governance alignment, resource requirements, and implementation viability. I'll have our team prepare detailed assessment within 2 weeks, after which we can determine appropriate next steps." Edward accepted this structured approach without his characteristic impatience for immediate commitment. As he gathered his materials, he paused momentarily, making extended eye contact with an expression I couldn't immediately categorize. "I underestimated you, Catherine," he acknowledged with uncharacteristic directness. "Not your capabilities. I've always recognized those, even when not properly acknowledging them. I underestimated your independence. The assumption that your expertise would remain accessible regardless of circumstances proved inaccurate." The acknowledgement stopped short of apology, but represented more honest self-assessment than I had witnessed from Edward in decades of marriage and business partnership. Whether this represented genuine personal growth or merely pragmatic adaptation to changed power dynamics remained an open question, one that would significantly influence potential collaboration viability. Miscalculation happens when assumptions remain untested too long, I responded evenly. "We'll evaluate your proposal objectively and respond accordingly." After Edward's departure, I remained in the conference room reflecting on the conversation's implications. His partnership proposal, offered potential business value while simultaneously representing remarkable reversal from his previous positioning. The strategic merit warranted serious consideration, despite the complicated personal history and trust considerations involved. When Melissa Chen arrived for our scheduled strategy discussion 30 minutes later, I shared Edward's proposal and my initial assessment of both business merits and relationship complexities. "Fascinating evolution," she observed after reviewing the materials. "The structure has genuine merit from pure business perspective, though the relational dynamics create obvious complications. What's your instinctive response beyond analytical assessment?" Her question cut to the personal core beneath professional considerations. The human reality of potentially collaborating with someone whose betrayal had been both personal and organizational after 40 years of shared history. Professionally, I recognize potential value in leveraging complementary capabilities, I acknowledged. The arrangement could accelerate certain market opportunities while avoiding resource redundancy. Personally, that requires more complex reconciliation. Melissa nodded thoughtfully. The professional assessment makes sense. The personal element is where genuine wisdom becomes essential. Not just emotional response, but integrated understanding of character patterns and sustainable relationship dynamics. Her framing crystallized the central question beyond business metrics. Edward had demonstrated remarkable adaptation to changed circumstances, but adaptation doesn't necessarily represent transformation. The patterns established over 40 years suggested a fundamental approach to relationship dynamics that prioritized control, recognition, and personal advantage, patterns that had manifested consistently across both personal and professional domains. His proposal effectively reverses our historical relationship dynamic, I observed. The arrangement would make him dependent on capabilities I control, rather than the inverse pattern that defined our previous 40 years, which creates both opportunity and concern, Melissa noted insightfully. Opportunity for genuinely balanced collaboration if his evolution is authentic. Concern for potential destabilization if the adaptation proves temporary tactical positioning rather than substantial growth. Over the following 2 weeks, our team conducted comprehensive assessment of Edward's proposal, evaluating business merits, governance implications, and implementation requirements. The analysis confirmed potential value creation while identifying significant structural modifications necessary to align with our established governance frameworks. When Edward returned for our follow-up meeting, I presented both the opportunity assessment and necessary structural modifications with transparent directness. The core concept demonstrates merit, I acknowledged, but implementation would require substantial governance alignment beyond what your initial framework proposed. The specific modifications I outlined would fundamentally transform his original vision, maintaining potential value creation while establishing clear boundaries, accountability mechanisms, and operational independence that protected Blackwell Industries from potential disruption. Rather than the integrated partnership he had proposed, the restructured approach positioned his contribution as a defined channel relationship with appropriate separation rather than dependency. This represents significant departure from my original concept, Edward noted after reviewing the modified structure, his expression carefully neutral. It does, I acknowledged without apology. The arrangement preserves value creation potential while establishing appropriate governance boundaries given historical context. The question is whether that modified structure remains attractive from your perspective. His response would prove telling beyond the specific business proposition. If his interest primarily concerned genuine value creation, the modified structure remained attractive despite diminished control opportunity. If his unstated objective involved re-establishing influence within the organization he had previously controlled, the governance boundaries would likely prove prohibitively restrictive. Edward considered the modified proposal with uncharacteristic patience, reviewing specific provisions with analytical attention rather than immediate reaction. After thorough consideration, He looked up with an expression that combined resignation and respect. "Not the arrangement I envisioned," he acknowledged, "but structured with characteristic thoroughness. The governance boundaries are more restrictive than I would prefer, though I recognize the practical necessity given recent history." He closed the folder containing our modified proposal with deliberate precision. "I'll need to consider whether this approach aligns with my objectives, given the substantial revisions to the original concept." "Of course," I replied. "Take whatever time you need for proper assessment. The opportunity remains viable if the structure meets your requirements." As Edward departed with our modified proposal, I recognized the interaction represented more than mere business negotiation. His response to the restructured arrangement would reveal whether his apparent evolution represented genuine growth or merely tactical adaptation to changed circumstances. 3 days later, his response arrived via formal communication rather than personal contact, another telling indicator of evolving relationship dynamics. The message was characteristically direct. "After careful consideration, I've determined the proposed structure doesn't align with my current strategic direction. The governance requirements, while understandable, create operational constraints that limit the entrepreneurial flexibility fundamental to my approach. I appreciate the thorough consideration and wish continued success for Blackwell Industries." The message confirmed what the modified proposal had been designed to reveal. Edward's primary interest involved influence recovery rather than value creation within appropriate governance boundaries. His rejection of a still valuable, but appropriately constrained business opportunity demonstrated priorities that remained fundamentally unchanged despite surface adaptations to new realities. "Not surprising, but still informative," Melissa observed when I shared the response during our evening strategy discussion. The modified structure offered substantial business value while preventing inappropriate organizational influence. Rejecting that balanced approach reveals priorities beyond mere commercial opportunity. Her assessment aligned with my own. Edward had adapted his tactical approach without fundamentally transforming the underlying patterns that had defined our 40-year relationship. The experience provided valuable closure regarding both personal and organizational boundaries moving forward. 6 months after assuming leadership of Blackwell Industries, the organization had not only stabilized but begun flourishing under the new governance approach I had established. Our market position had strengthened through enhanced operational integration capabilities. Client relationships had deepened through transparent engagement models. Employee retention and satisfaction metrics showed significant improvement as collaborative frameworks replaced personality-driven authority structures. Edward's competitive ventures had achieved limited market traction without the implementation capabilities previously provided through Blackwell Industries' operational infrastructure. Victoria Palmer had completed her provisional period and transitioned to permanent role within Sarah Kendall's international operations team, having demonstrated genuine value contribution separate from her previous connection with Edward. Most significantly, the organization had successfully transitioned from personality-driven leadership to sustainable operational excellence, transformation that would endure beyond any individual's tenure or influence. The methodical approach I had applied throughout 40 years of being systematically underestimated had ultimately created foundation for success that transcended personal recognition or authority. As I reviewed quarterly performance reports reflecting these results, Eleanor stopped by my office with notification that our divorce proceedings had been finalized, officially ending 43 years of marriage concurrent with the successful organizational transformation I had led. "Interesting timing," Eleanor observed with characteristic perception. "Personal and professional transitions reaching formal conclusions simultaneously. The parallel completion seemed symbolically appropriate, final resolution of both relationships, with the man who had simultaneously been my husband and business partner through decades of systematic underestimation. Both necessary transformations, I acknowledged, and both ultimately constructive, despite the difficult transition process. As Eleanor departed, I opened the leather portfolio my grandmother had given me decades earlier, the one constant companion throughout my journey from overlooked contributor to acknowledged leader. Inside were the preliminary notes for Blackwell Industries' 5-year strategic plan, my vision for the organization's continued evolution beyond the foundation we had already established. The methodical approach that had allowed me to succeed despite decades of underestimation now served as blueprint for organizational transformation that would benefit hundreds of employees and thousands of clients through sustainable excellence rather than individual charisma. That enduring impact represented more meaningful legacy than personal recognition or authority could ever provide. Vindication of principles maintained through 40 years of being systematically undervalued by someone who should have recognized my true capabilities. The expression on Edward's face when I revealed those capabilities remained satisfying memory. But the organization's flourishing under leadership principles he had consistently dismissed provided more substantive validation than any personal reaction could offer. Success built on operational excellence and collaborative innovation, rather than individual authority, represented the ultimate demonstration of what had been systematically overlooked throughout our 40-year relationship. 5 years had passed since I assumed leadership of Blackwell Industries, 5 years of transformation that had exceeded even my most optimistic projections. What began as crisis management following Edward's departure had evolved into comprehensive organizational reinvention that positioned us as industry leaders in both operational excellence and innovation. The quarterly board meeting had just concluded, with unanimous approval of our expansion into emerging sustainable manufacturing technologies, investment that represented both significant growth opportunity and expression of values I had methodically integrated throughout our corporate culture. As board members filed from the room with expressions ranging from satisfaction to genuine enthusiasm, Melissa Chen lingered behind, her role having evolved from supportive ally to trusted board chairperson after my transition to CEO 2 years earlier. Another successful strategic presentation, she observed with characteristic perception. The sustainability initiative's unanimous approval reflects how thoroughly you've transformed this organization's decision frameworks. 5 years ago, those same board members would have prioritized immediate returns over long-term positioning. Her assessment captured precisely what I considered our most significant achievement, shifting fundamental organizational values from short-term transaction focus to sustainable relationship development across all stakeholders. The metrics validated this approach with growth that had outpaced industry averages while establishing reputation for integrity that attracted both premium clients and exceptional talent. The foundation was always there, I acknowledged, gathering materials into the leather portfolio my grandmother had given me, now showing honorable wear from years of constant use. It just needed proper cultivation once the obstacles were removed. Melissa's smile reflected shared understanding of the unnamed obstacles referenced, Edward's leadership approach that had prioritized personal authority over collaborative excellence. Our unspoken agreement to refrain from personal criticism maintained professional standards while acknowledging realities we both recognized from experience. Speaking of removed obstacles, she transitioned deliberately. Have you seen the industry announcement this morning? I had not, having been focused on board preparation since early dawn. Melissa passed her tablet across the table, displaying announcement from modest regional manufacturing firm that had shown little previous distinction. Veteran industry leader Edward Blackwell announces retirement. Meridian Manufacturing acquired by Consolidated Industries. The brief article detailed Edward's departure from the small company he had established following his unsuccessful competitive ventures against Blackwell Industries. After several years of modest performance and declining market position, the firm had been acquired by larger conglomerate with minimal continuation of existing management or strategic direction. Interesting timing, I observed neutrally, though the symbolic significance wasn't lost on either of us. Edward's retirement announcement coincided almost precisely with the 5-year anniversary of my assumption of leadership at Blackwell Industries. Parallel journeys with dramatically different outcomes. Trajectory divergence is always instructive, Melissa noted diplomatically. Limited foundation eventually constrains even the most charismatic leadership. Her assessment encapsulated the fundamental difference in our approaches. Edward had always prioritized personality-driven leadership supported by operational capabilities he controlled but never fully valued. When those supporting capabilities were removed, his charismatic approach proved insufficient to sustain organizational success, despite his considerable relationship skills and strategic vision. Our conversation was interrupted by Sarah Kendall, now serving as President of International Operations after demonstrating exceptional leadership capabilities throughout our expansion initiatives. Her professional growth perfectly exemplified the talent development emphasis I had established as cornerstone of our organizational culture. "Sorry to interrupt," she began with characteristic efficiency, "but I thought you'd want immediate update on the Westbrook acquisition integration. The operational alignment is exceeding timeline projections by approximately 17%, with client retention at 94% compared to projected 85%. The update represented significant validation of our methodical approach to what had been the largest acquisition in company history. Strategic expansion that integrated former competitors' capabilities while maintaining relationship continuity with their established client base. Excellent progress, I acknowledged, making brief notes in my ever-present portfolio. Please extend my personal appreciation to the integration team for their exceptional work, particularly regarding client relationship transitions. After Sarah departed, Melissa observed thoughtfully, "The contrast between your acquisition approach and Edward's final business chapter provides interesting bookend to this 5-year transformation journey." She was right, though I had deliberately avoided making such direct comparisons myself. Where Edward had ultimately failed to sustain even modest independent venture, we had successfully executed industry-significant acquisition that strengthened both companies through methodical integration, focused on stakeholder value rather than personal authority. Different priorities yield different outcomes, I acknowledged simply. Our focus has always been building sustainable organizational capabilities rather than individual positioning. As we concluded our discussion and departed the boardroom, I reflected on the journey's unexpected dimension revealed by Edward's retirement announcement. While I had found personal and professional fulfillment beyond anything I had imagined possible 5 years earlier, Edward had experienced progressive diminishment of the authority and recognition that had always formed his core identity. Victoria. Palmer had provided occasional updates through appropriate professional channels, describing Edward's increasingly frustrated attempts to replicate his previous success without the organizational infrastructure and operational expertise he had. Always taken for granted, where he had once commanded attention in industry gatherings, he had gradually become peripheral figure whose expansive claims found decreasing receptive audience as implementation failures accumulated. Though I took no satisfaction in his diminishment, the parallel journey offered undeniable validation of principles I had maintained throughout 40 years of systematic underestimation. Edward's approach, prioritizing personal authority while devaluing operational excellence and collaborative innovation, had proven fundamentally unsustainable once separated from the supporting capabilities I had provided throughout our marriage and business partnership. Later that evening, as I reviewed materials for the following day's executive planning session, my assistant forwarded message that had arrived through formal channels rather than direct contact. "Catherine, congratulations on the Westbrook acquisition. Impressive strategic positioning. Circumstances have evolved significantly since our last interaction. Would welcome opportunity to discuss potential advisory arrangement leveraging my relationship history with several key industry participants. Available at your convenience to explore mutually beneficial structure. Edward." The outreach was remarkable in its unintended revelation of unchanged fundamental perspectives, despite 5 years of divergent experience. Even now, facing retirement following unsuccessful independent ventures, Edward positioned himself as valuable authority, offering benefit rather than acknowledging the relationship's actual dynamic, particularly given Blackwell Industries demonstrated success without his involvement. After brief consideration, I composed equally formal response. Edward, thank you for the acknowledgement regarding our recent strategic expansion. Blackwell Industries maintains comprehensive industry relationship development capability through our established executive team, with current emphasis on next-generation leaders who will guide the organization through coming decades of innovation. I appreciate your consideration, but must decline exploration of advisory arrangements at this time. I wish you fulfilling retirement and personal satisfaction in your next chapter. Catherine. The exchange provided fitting conclusion to 5-year transformation journey, professional acknowledgement without personal animosity, clarity without unnecessary harshness. Edward would always remain part of the organization's history, but that history had been definitively transcended through methodical development of sustainable organizational excellence, independent of any individual authority. 2 weeks later, I received unexpected email from Robert Campbell, the Westbrook Manufacturing CEO, who had initially approached our relationship with skepticism, but had become valued strategic partner through our transparent engagement model, Catherine something. You might find interesting. Edward reached out suggesting advisory arrangement with our organization following acquisition announcement. Among his positioning points was claim that your successful integration approach reflected fundamentals he had established during his leadership tenure. Thought you should know, given historical context, though we've obviously declined his proposal, given our established relationship. Looking forward to our continued partnership through this integration and beyond. Robert. The message prompted unexpected laughter, genuine amusement at Edward's consistent pattern despite all evidence of its ineffectiveness. Even now, following 5 years of definitively divergent outcomes, he maintained self-concept as organizational architect rather than acknowledging the operational reality that had always existed behind his carefully constructed public narrative. My response to Robert was straightforward professional acknowledgement, without personal commentary. Thank you for the information and continued partnership. The integration team reports exceptional progress, with particular appreciation for your organization's collaborative approach throughout this process. Later that evening, reviewing the day's events with quiet reflection, I recognized the ironic completion of patterns established throughout my 40-year marriage and business partnership with Edward. Even now, facing retirement after unsuccessful independent ventures while watching the organization flourish beyond his involvement, he maintained fundamental inability to recognize the comprehensive capabilities he had systematically undervalued. That persistent blindness had once represented my greatest professional frustration, the continuous devaluation of contributions that made his success possible. Now, 5 years into organizational transformation that had definitively validated those same capabilities, his unchanged perspective represented neither frustration nor validation, but simply historical artifact from chapter conclusively transcended, through methodical development of sustainable excellence. The following morning, preparing for executive planning session focused on our next 5-year strategic vision, I placed my grandmother's well-worn leather portfolio on the conference table, alongside the elegant new one Melissa had given me following my CEO appointment. The juxtaposition represented perfect symbolic bridge between foundation principles and forward vision, honoring methodical approach that had overcome systematic underestimation while embracing continued evolution that would carry the organization forward for decades beyond any individual leadership tenure. The real victory, my grandmother had once told me while reviewing accounting books after school, isn't proving others wrong about you. It's building something that endures beyond whatever limited perspective they maintained. As our executive team assembled for planning discussion that would shape organizational direction for years beyond my own leadership tenure, I recognized the profound truth in her wisdom. The sustainable excellence we had methodically built would benefit generations of employees, clients, and communities, regardless of whether Edward or anyone else ever acknowledged my role in its development. That enduring impact, not personal recognition or authority, represented the ultimate validation of principles maintained through 40 years of being systematically undervalued by someone who should have recognized my true capabilities. The organization's flourishing under those principles provided more substantive vindication than any personal acknowledgement could ever offer. A legacy measured not in individual achievement, but in sustainable excellence that would continue, benefiting others long after both Edward and I had become mere historical footnotes in its continuing evolution. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.